We are very fortunate to have Dr. Charles Ferguson with us. Charles and I go back, I don't know, 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, at least 6, I think, yeah.
We've worked together on a number of nuclear projects, and it's been a pleasure to work with somebody that's smart and knowledgeable and has the experience that Charles has. So let me give you a little bit of his background. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He was a nuclear submarine officer upon graduation. He got out of the nuclear Navy and decided that he wanted to pursue a PhD in physics, which he did at Boston University. And about halfway through the Boston University thing, he got interested in policy. So he finished his PhD, and his dissertation was earthquake simulation. So he says he doesn't know anything about geology, only how to model earthquakes. But then he moved into the policy realm, and he is a unique, one of a few individuals who has a technical background working in nuclear policy. His first position was with the State Department in nuclear safety. Then he moved to the Monterey Institute for Nuclear Studies, and then he moved to the Council on Foreign Relations, where he was their nuclear policy expert. And now he's currently the president of the Federation of American Scientists. Just last week, he appeared on NBC Nightly News, Hardball with Chris Matthews, Fox News, the PBS NewsHour, and as far as radio shows, he was with Diane Reed on NPR and on Science Friday. He was going to be on Space the Nation last Sunday, but Omar Gaddafi bumped him out of the way. So he has just completed, he was editing an article that goes to the journal Nature, which will be published in the next issue of Nature. So with all these credentials, he's a really nice guy to work with. I've enjoyed it, and he also is an expert. He's been to Japan, and he knows his facilities, he knows the Japanese. So,
well, thank you very much, Frank. Hopefully I can live up to that great introduction. It's been a pleasure working with Frank over the years. We met, it's about 6.5 years ago. He was my student, if I call him that. It was kind of awkward. I'm up there at a summer course about nuclear nonproliferation, and there's this guy in the audience and looks very professorial, raised his hand in my lecture when I'm talking about uranium hexafluoride, and he said something, asked a question like, well, how do you produce that? And I'm hemming and hawing. He goes, I'm just a physicist, a nuclear engineer. What do I know about chemistry and how you actually manufacture this stuff? So I could tell I had a ringer in the audience, and we hit it off right away. So it's been great working with Frank Settle over the years, and it's also a lot of fun coming back to Washington University. I've been here many times over the past basically 5 years that we've had our official collaboration between Washington University and the Council on Foreign Relations, and now Washington University and Federation of American Scientists. So Frank, I don't think mentioned this, but in a few months, he and I are going to have a report coming out. We're the editors of a report called The Future of Nuclear Power in the United States. And so this talk is sort of a kind of a warm-up act to see if he agrees with my points in the talk here. And I can't cover everything. I know we have a limited amount of time. And yesterday evening, and as I was putting together these slides, of course, in my sleep and this morning, I'm thinking, oh, I could put this in, I could put that in. I think there's so many implications as to this event that we don't know yet how it's going to, I use the word fallout, it's a bad term, but it's barely a week and a half into this tragedy. And as much as we may complain if we're feeling overworked, we have no right to complain when the people of Japan have been suffering so much. And I have so many friends and colleagues in Japan, been trying to email them, and the friends and colleagues I know, fortunately they're safe and their families are safe. But now this afternoon we're going to look at what are the potential consequences for the nuclear industry, in particular for the United States. Okay, so let me show you kind of what I'll kind of cover here in roughly the next half an hour, and then I look forward to having a conversation with you and getting your thoughts as to what may be happening, what may happen as a result of this event. So first I'm going to talk about nuclear power's high cost even prior to the Japanese event. At low price of natural gas and abundant natural gas is making nuclear power even more cost uncompetitive than it had been before, and that hasn't changed. In fact, it's looking a lot worse for nuclear in terms of its economic competitiveness potential. Then I'll turn to the specific boiling water reactor design used at the Japanese nuclear power plant and look at some of the concerns about that design, kind of the good and bad of it. And then talk about this issue of the spent fuel pools that you've been reading so much in the paper and seeing on the news. Are they potentially dangerous? What should we be doing about overcrowded conditions in spent fuel pools? And of course it's going to lead to the issue of nuclear waste policy. So are we ever going to get a permanent repository at Yucca Mountain or any other place? We don't know, and I don't know what the implications are in terms of this event, but we'll find out in the coming months. And then I'll conclude by looking at whether there's going to be any kind of moratorium on nuclear power plant construction within the United States. We've seen announcements in a few other countries for moratoria while safety checks are being made. Some U.S. politicians are calling for a stop to nuclear power plant construction before do safety checks and look at emergency response before we move ahead with new construction. Okay, so basically we need to know that nuclear power plants, a large nuclear power plant, is an expensive project. It can cost several $billions for a large power reactor. A large power reactor is at least 1,000 megawatts of electrical power, typically now greater than that. And the AREVA EPR that Frank Settle and I visited almost exactly 2 years ago, we were in France together with a former Washington Lee University student, Richard Cleary, spent a week in France touring various sites, and we saw the new EPR under construction at Flamanville. And that plant is about a 1,600 megawatt electric plant. That's one of the largest power plants right now in the world. And there are a couple of being constructed, and they're running into various delays and cost overruns. And so the price of nuclear power tends to be going up in some countries. Other countries, the cost has actually gone down somewhat. South Korea has figured out how to keep the cost of nuclear power relatively cheap compared to other sources. They've been able to complete their latest reactor in just over 4 years, which I believe is a record for nuclear power plant construction, and pretty much keep it on budget. That has allowed the South Korean government to form a deal with the United Arab Emirates, UAE, to build 4 power reactors over the next 10 years. So this is one of the major projects underway now in the Middle East in terms of nuclear power. And so you need to pay attention as to what South Korea is doing and why they are successful. And remember the movie, well, some of you may be too young to remember the movie The Graduate. There are other people in the audience. Remember that famous line in The Graduate? A lot of famous lines, but the line about what's the future business that doesn't have to care? Plastics, right? So go on the plastics. With the Korean reactors, the key word is concrete. They were able to develop this quick-drying, high-quality concrete to allow them to keep the cost down and the quality up in building their latest nuclear reactors. And they're also able, through smart project management, to do a lot of the aspects of the nuclear power construction simultaneously. So there are lessons to be learned in certain parts of the world as to how to build nuclear power plants more efficiently. But in the United States, we're still kind of stuck. We haven't completed construction of a nuclear reactor since 1996. That was at Watts Bar in Tennessee. And we haven't actually completed an order of a plant in over 30 years. So prior to 3 Mile Island was the last time that a plant was ordered and taken to construction. That Watts Bar facility took over 30 years from the time the contract was signed until the plant got into operation. So there's a lot of hurdles to cross in terms of economics. And the U.S. government is trying to offer various economic stimuli to get nuclear power going again in the United States. So we've seen streamlined regulations, and those actually go back to the early 1990s. I think it was 1992. I'm looking at Al Carr. I think he's a resident expert on this in terms of the combined operating license procedure that was designed to fast-track, so-called fast-track the regulatory process while still giving the public opportunities at certain times to intervene where appropriate. We're now testing out that system right now to see if it is truly streamlined, and there's a lot of back and forth between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the utilities and the reactor designers to make sure there's enough information and a complete package when the NRC does the review. And these are very complex licensing procedures. The government is also offering various federal loan guarantees up to 80% of the cost, of the capital cost of a plant. The government is putting forward several $billion worth of federal loan guarantees, and some politicians would like the federal government to offer even more, maybe upwards of $100 billion worth of federal loan guarantees. So that's a bit of a controversial point, but I think even those who are somewhat skeptical of nuclear power, and even those who are very much in favor of the free market, will still say, okay, since we already have these federal loan guarantees in place in the 2005 Energy Policy Act, let's at least allow the first tranche of them to go forward and see if they actually do something in terms of a stimulus. The government has also offered tax credits for the production of electricity from low carbon sources or near zero carbon sources, such as nuclear power, wind, and solar, and geothermal. And so it's not just nuclear that's offered an incentive in that respect. And there's other things we can talk about in terms of liability insurance, et cetera, but in interest of time, let me jump ahead and just underscore that the fossil fuel availability and the pricing, especially of natural gas, has a huge is a huge factor in determining whether nuclear power is going to go forward or not. So what was interesting was about 2 weeks ago at the American Enterprise Institute, John Rowe, who's the CEO of Exelon is the utility in the United States with the largest number of nuclear reactors. I think they have about 18 or 19 now. They're going to decommission in about 7 or 8 years the Oyster Creek plant in New Jersey, but they'll still have the largest number of reactors of any utility. Mr. Rowe has been very supportive of nuclear power, as you can imagine, as his role as CEO of that company. He also considers himself a kind of a conservative free market environmentalist. What I mean by that is he favors putting a price on carbon emissions. So it would benefit his company for sure. So if you can say carbon dioxide has a certain price, so much per metric ton of carbon dioxide, whether it's $25 a ton or $50 or $100, certain prices will then send a market signal that will tend to favor certain types of low or no carbon energy sources, such as nuclear power. Well, let's face political reality. With the new Congress we have now, we're not going to get any kind of carbon cap and trade legislation passed. And so Mr. Rowe said, we got to face that reality, and we also have to face the reality, as he said in his talk a couple weeks ago, natural gas is queen, and you would be a fool, he said, to bet against a lady. And he's a lot more eloquent speaker than I am. He reads ancient philosophy, and he can quote it off the top of his head. Very, very charming man. I happen to be sitting by chance next to the head of investor relations at Exelon. And for full disclosure, I'll mention that I'm a shareholder of Exelon. I don't own a lot of stock, but I'll at least make sure that's out in the open. And so I was talking to the head of investor relations, and she said, we've looked at this as a company, and we see that with the Marcellus Shale and the hydraulic fracturing process, that their estimate, reliable estimates that for the next 2 to 3 decades or even longer, there's probably going to be very abundant natural gas supplies in the United States and at low prices. And the reality is that nuclear power can't compete with that. One irony of his talk was that he titled it, "Above All, Do No Harm." And you see that the date of his talk was March 8th, just 3 days before the earthquake. And I don't know, Mr. Rowe, if he had to do all over again and hop in a time machine and not use that title for his talk. He meant first do no harm in terms of energy policy. He didn't want Congress to go in there and start messing things up. He said, look, if they're not going to pass carbon cap and trade, they shouldn't go in there and picking winners and losers. They should just let the market kind of figure it out. So he was speaking at American Enterprise Institute. So he's playing his audience, but he really firmly believes in that position. Okay, so I don't know if those in the back of the room can see this map, but this is a map I got off the Nuclear Regulatory Commission website. Right now, we have 104 operating commercial reactors in the United States, providing roughly about 100 gigawatts of electrical power, and that's roughly about 20% of the electricity in the United States comes from nuclear power. About 50% of our electricity still comes from burning coal, and roughly 20% or so is from natural gas, and that's a growing source, as I've indicated. And we got a pretty significant slice from hydro, and a fairly small slice from non-hydro renewables, wind and solar. Okay, so Mr. Rowe in his talk, he said, he's hard at, he's not good at predicting exactly what's going to happen in terms of natural gas and coal and nuclear, but his estimates are that over the next 20 years, natural gas might displace anywhere to 10 to 15% of our coal use, but really not displace too much nuclear, but nuclear is not going to add anything additional in a significant way except for maybe a handful of reactors based on the federal loan guarantees and other incentives. So one thing to notice in this chart, it's hard to read these numbers, but I'll show you a slide just a minute or just a moment from now where it's better to understand this point that our nuclear power fleet is aging. As I said a few minutes ago, we haven't built a reactor in a very long time, and we haven't ordered new reactors in an even longer time still, in over 30 years. So the fleet is fairly old. Most of the reactors are at their nominal 40-year life point. Now, the 40 years isn't some kind of magic number that the plant just breaks down at 40 years. That was just a decent guess, that the plants could operate up to 40 years, and then when we get to that point, we'd reassess and see if things are operating safely and that the plant's life could be extended another 20 years. Almost all the reactors that have applied for license extensions in the past 10 years have received those license extensions for another 20 years. So that extends the fleet for another 2 decades. But beyond that, we could be facing what I call a retirement cliff. So in this graph right here, I'm plotting on the x-axis the year, starting at the year 2030, so 19 years from now, and on the y-axis the number of reactors that we have. So as I said, if all the reactors operating right now get 20-year life extensions, so that we go from where we are now to 2031 with 104 or so reactors. And then if we don't get additional life extensions and we don't build new nuclear reactors, then over the course of the next 5 to 10 years after that, you see this big drop-off in the number of nuclear reactors in the United States. In fact, it goes from about 100 down to about 50 in the course of 10 years. So at 2040, which isn't that far away, and I think probably most of us in the room will be alive then. If nuclear power is not revived in the U.S., it will fall down to that point. And if we go even further out to mid-century, the nuclear reactors will have to be all retired unless we can further extend their life. All right, so let me get into some of the mechanics of the boiling water reactor design that we've seen play out in Japan. So here's a schematic of a BWR power plant, just kind of the major parts. And there won't be a quiz at the end. I spent 1 year at nuclear power school in the Navy learning this design and the other design, the pressurized water reactor design. And in fact, I have my qualifications on the pressurized water reactor design, but I know enough about this to be not so dangerous, so I can walk you through the basics. So at the center here, you have the reactor core with all the nuclear fuel, where the nuclear reactions are going on. And then during power operations, the control rods are pulled out of the core. As you can see that the control rods are actually at the bottom of the reactor vessel, which people have raised concerns about this. So there have been some incidents where control rods, if you try to insert them to shut down the reactor, they can get stuck. So that can be a problem. So one reason maybe the boiling water reactor design isn't favored over the pressurized water reactor design, but there are other benefits to this type of design. It's a simpler design in that you have one basic loop in which water and steam circulate. So the reactor core during safe operations should be full or must be fully covered with liquid water. And then at the top of the reactor pressure vessel is where steam is formed. And that steam is directed through this pipe. This is what's labeled the steam line, impinging on turbines, and then they go round, and then they're connected to electrical generator. That's how you produce the electricity. And then the steam is condensed in a condenser and turned back into liquid water, and that's pumped back into the reactor core after it's heated up. You don't want cold water hitting the nuclear fuel, because that might cause fuel damage. You want to do some heating up before it goes back into the core. So it takes that reactor heat to create steam, and you start the process all over again. So, and then you have these recirculation pumps here, and this loop right here to keep water also circulating. You got to keep that cool, the core cool, as you all been following in the news. And I'm sure you've all learned that when you shut the reactor down, that there's still energy that's being produced. There's what's radioactive decay heat. And immediately after shutdown, about 6% there's about 6% of the power that there was right before shutdown. So reactor 1 at Fukushima was a 440 megawatt electric power plant. So when that shut down, you multiply that by 6%, and you have still that much power that's being produced. And you have to get rid of that heat, or else the water will keep boiling and boiling away if you don't have that circulation. And the reactor fuel rods can become uncovered, and then it could become damaged. You don't have a meltdown right away. That's another term that's been thrown around a lot pretty loosely in the press, saying, well, the reactor fuel rods become uncovered, and boom, things melt down. It's all over. You've got this, this slag heap of liquid fuel, and it doesn't happen that rapidly. And there are a lot of intervening stages. The fuel first can blister and buckle and release some radioactive fission products, especially radioactive gases like radioactive xenon. And then if the temperatures keep getting higher and higher and the fuel remains uncovered, then you can start to actually have a transformation into a liquid state and have some partial melting. And then as it further heats up, you can actually have close to a full meltdown. But there are a lot of intervening steps along the way. And as far as we know, as far as the information we have from Japan, that we haven't seen anything nearly that drastic happen yet. It's believed that there has been fuel damage at least reactors 1, 2, and 3. Those are the 3 reactors that were operating right as the earthquake struck. And It's actually the latest email I got from TEPCO. I'm on the TEPCO's email distribution list. So they said that for reactors 1, 2, and 3, the top roughly 1.3 to 1.75 meters of those fuel rods are uncovered. So that's still not good. They're still trying to get the plant under control, I think, just even based on that information. Apparently over this past weekend, they've got electric power restored to the power plant from off-site. That's good news. They need to get these pumps going again. They need to get the primary coolant system going again instead of doing these pretty desperate measures and shooting in seawater through water cannons and at one point trying to drop seawater in through helicopters. Here's a diagram you may have seen a lot. It's the cutaway of a BWR Mark I containment structure. And there's kind of layers within layers. The one concept that you should walk away with from this talk is defense in depth. That what that means is that there are layers of safety systems, layers of protection to prevent radioactive fission products and other radioactive materials from going into the environment. The first layer of protection is the fuel cladding itself, typically made of a zirconium alloy called zircaloy. And so as long as that's intact, then radioactive fission products can't escape the environment. But if we have this fuel deformation or fuel damage starts to happen, then the zircaloy cladding can break down and start to oxidize. And so then what can happen is that with the interaction of steam on the zircaloy, hydrogen gas can be produced. And the hydrogen gas, if it builds up to such a pressure and volume that it's ignited, you can have a hydrogen explosion. It's not a nuclear explosion by any means. It's a hydrogen explosion. It's still serious, mind you. But so far, what we've seen is not major damage in the primary containment structure, except perhaps in, I think it was reactor 2, looks like there may have been some damage in the steam suppression system. The hydrogen explosions that we've seen have basically blown holes in the top roofs here, this outer kind of containment material that's not that strong. The strong containment structure is this primary containment that's wrapped around the reactor pressure vessel, and that's the main containment that you don't want to suffer a breach. So basically, the problem with this design, though, is that there's not a lot of volume in that containment vessel right here. So as steam starts to build up, then you have to vent and vent and vent to prevent an overpressurization that could lead to possible rupture of the containment structure. So that's the situation that they're in now. They're doing a lot of venting to release that pressure, and during the process of venting, some radioactive materials are released. Okay, so there have been concerns about this design going back to 1972, and that was the year after Fukushima reactor number 1 began operations. And currently we have 23 reactors in the US with this type of design or similar design. And of those, there are about 6 that have what's called an ice condenser emergency cooling system. And there are concerns raised about that about 10 years ago in this book by Kenneth Bergeron. Dr. Bergeron, he wrote this book called Tritium on Ice. He's a PhD physicist, worked at Sandia National Labs. He was an expert on these types of containment systems, done a lot of computer simulations, a lot of testing on these systems, and he grew concerned that there wasn't enough attention to potential safety problems with these types of plants in certain types of accident scenarios. And his title of his book refers to the production of tritium, a nuclear weapons material, in certain commercial reactors. The Watts Bar 1 reactor, which I mentioned some time ago, the last reactor to be built in the United States, is actually producing tritium for nuclear weapons now. That was a decision made back in 1999 by Bill Richardson when he's Secretary of Energy. That's another side issue. We won't get sidetracked in that. We'll focus on the safety issue. So throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, there were recommendations to improve the design of these BWR containment systems. One recommendation was to install filters on the vent system. So as you vent during these types of accident scenarios, the filters would trap radioactive materials, so you try to minimize the amount of radioactive stuff going out into the environment. And the industry kind of pushed back on that, was my understanding. They felt it was going to be too expensive to install those filter systems. And I don't think it was done. It may have been done in some of the plants in the U.S., but I'm not sure. Okay, now let's turn to the issue of seismic hazards and earthquakes. So a lot of questions have been raised in the past week. Are U.S. nuclear plants in jeopardy of a similar type of earthquake event as we've seen in Japan? And here's a map from U.S. Geological Survey showing, as you might expect, no surprise here, in the west coast of the United States, the so-called Ring of Fire in Asia Pacific. Yes, indeed, we see a lot of earthquakes and some major earthquakes in California and parts of the U.S. Upper Northwest. So there are two nuclear plants that are in California now, San Onofre and Diablo Canyon. And in Diablo Canyon 3 years ago, 2008, there was the shoreline fault that was discovered there. And there was a new investigation. The utility operator said they're still confident that the plant could withstand an earthquake of a magnitude 6.8, and then there's an additional safety margin above that. Still, some citizens groups are worried about that plant because of this new fault that had been discovered nearby. There's another earthquake zone inside the continental U.S., and if you're not a geologist or a seismologist, or even someone like me when you did your graduate studies and you pretended to be that, I didn't pretend to be that kind of person, but I did these computer simulations on earthquakes. And the computer simulations I did were more about the California type system, the strike slip system. In near Missouri, there's been intraplate earthquakes of fairly strong magnitude. In fact, in 1812 was almost exactly 200 years ago, there was a huge earthquake, which now we probably consider up to magnitude 8 on the Richter scale at New Madrid, not Madrid, but Madrid, I think is how they pronounce it. And if you look at the U.S. reactors near that fault system, there are roughly 27, or about a quarter of the reactor fleet, that are roughly within that area. If we had gone back to the other map I showed, you can see there are some reactors even nearby that I'm not saying it's likely to experience such an event, but we know that about 200 years ago there was a massive earthquake near Missouri. Okay, so spent fuel pools. What are we going to do? What are we doing about the spent fuel generated from your nuclear power plants? Well, every year, almost 2,000 tons of spent fuel come out of the 104 reactors in the U.S., and that has to then immediately go into deep pools of water. This is very hot material, as we've been seeing in this past week. So it has to be cooled down, and typically it has to remain in a cooling pool for 5 years before you can take it out. After 5 years, it's possible that then to transfer that spent fuel either to an interim facility using dry storage casks, or if we had a permanent repository or some kind of permanent waste processing facility, we could ship it there, but we don't have that. So what's been happening is most of the spent fuel, almost 70,000 tons now, have been building up at all the power plant sites. And a lot of the pools are becoming overcrowded. So to save space, the companies have been re-racking, and to prevent criticality accidents, they insert rods made of boron to absorb neutrons to prevent that kind of an accident. But there is a possibility that these pools become drained, that the zirconium cladding around the fuel could catch fire. And so we've seen this maybe play out in Japan. We see at reactor unit 4 at Fukushima that the spent fuel pool there has apparently suffered some significant damage. There's a discrepancy about whether the pool is empty or has some water in it, but I think both sides agree that there has been significant drainage The chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Gregory Yasko, last week said to Congress in testimony he had evidence that there wasn't any water in the pool, and the Japanese and some U.S. nuclear industry people said there appears to be some water in the pool. Nonetheless, it's a cause for concern, and you don't want that material to catch fire and potentially lead to a dispersal of radioactivity. So what's ironic was about 10 years ago, right after September 11th, there were some independent experts, Robert Alvarez is one of them. He called attention to the possibility of terrorists attacking these spent fuel pools and leading to a dispersal of radiation. And I don't know if anyone was seriously thinking back then that an earthquake and a tsunami could actually lead to such an event possibly taking place. So what can we do? So we could transfer, and Bob Alvarez recommended in his paper, transferring the overcrowded spent fuel at the 104 reactors in the U.S. to these dry storage casks, which are very safe and secure. You can fire rocket-propelled grenades at these things, and they'll withstand that kind of an attack. And he estimated that it will cost anywhere from $3 to $5 billion to do that transfer. Now, the industry said, oh, wait a minute, that's a lot of money. Why should we spend it? Is there a real threat here? And the other concern they raised was, you have to do then 2 transfers, because ultimately we want to store that spent fuel in a permanent repository, so you need to ship it to whether it's Yucca Mountain or some other place we might open up. So we want to minimize the exposure of the workers. So why do we need to do 2 transfers? One to a dry storage cask, and then another transfer later on to a cask that would be shipped to Yucca Mountain. So the industry has kind of said, no, we don't need to do this. The National Academy of Sciences did a report about 5 or 6 years ago saying, it's possible that these pools could become drained and catch on fire, but it's not very likely. And they basically agreed with Alvarez's assessment in terms of the cost. Well, is any other country actually doing this? Well, Germany is actually. The Germans, admittedly, most of them are pretty anti-nuclear, and they want to phase out their nuclear power plants. And they decided back in the 1990s to do this transfer of the spent nuclear fuel from these pools to the cask, and they were willing to spend the extra money. Okay, so will we ever get Yucca Mountain, and does this event in Japan have any relevance to Yucca Mountain? I don't know. But we do know that President Obama and Secretary of Energy Chu and Senator Reid, they formed kind of a compromise. They said, and this is very political, was that during the presidential campaign, Obama said, okay, I'm willing to support Senator Reid and say we're not going to move into opening up Yucca Mountain, despite the fact that the previous administration, Bush administration, had gotten a vote from Congress to open up Yucca Mountain. And so it left us with really no options for permanent disposal of the spent fuel. So the compromise was that Senator Reid said to the President and Secretary of Energy, okay, let's form a blue ribbon commission. And so we have, on the Republican side, General Brent Scowcroft, and on the Democratic side, Representative Lee Hamilton heading this up. And they have a cast of technical experts as part of the commission, and they're trying to come up with a report by this summer to take a fresh look at the options. And some would say, well, this was very conveniently timed because we had the Senate elections last November and Senator Reid was reelected. So perhaps there is a new opening for Yucca Mountain, and perhaps this Japanese event may create a new opening. I don't know. Let's stay tuned. Okay, so let me just kind of wrap up here. So another concern that was raised from the Japanese event is the use of plutonium in reactor fuel. And I think Professor Settle mentioned that I've been to Japan. I was at the Rakasho reprocessing facility in August of 2007. I toured that. Seemed to be very well run and very clean and pretty safe, just to my one-day tour. But the Japanese government's been struggling. They've spent about $28 billion on this facility, And the reason they've done it is that they really feel very energy insecure. They worried back in the 1970s that there wouldn't be enough uranium available to run their nuclear power program, so they were willing to pay an extra cost to recycle plutonium into what's called mixed oxide fuel. And we can debate whether that was wise or not, whether that was a good investment or not, but the point is that now there are safety concerns about the use of these plutonium fuels. Reactor number 3 at Fukushima recently was fueled with MOX fuel, and if there is a release of radioactive material from that site, then though I think that will call into question this policy of using these plutonium-based fuels, because the health hazard does go up. It's maybe not a huge additional health effect, but there is an additional health risk in using more plutonium in fuels instead of using uranium and fresh fuel. Over time, in any reactor, even if it's just a uranium-fueled reactor, plutonium is being produced. So by the end of the life of a spent fuel assembly in a reactor core, 1% by mass of that material is plutonium. So not that there isn't a risk in the other reactors of a plutonium release, but the question is there a greater risk in these plutonium-fueled reactors? In the United States, we've decided back in the 1970s, actually it was President Ford who made the first decision, and then it was President Carter that reiterated it in 1977 for the United States to shift away from using reprocessing and plutonium fuels. But in the Clinton administration, the United States agreed with Russia to dispose of weapons-grade plutonium, weapons-origin plutonium, I should say more specifically, by using it in MOX and certain reactors. That was one pathway. The second pathway was just to mix plutonium in with radioactive materials, prevent theft of that material. This MOX program in the U.S. may change as a result of the Japanese accident. I'm not predicting it will, but I already know that there is some new debate on this issue. At least last week I had a couple of reporters talk to me about it, and I know there's been some press coverage on this. So last slide or two here, wrapping up. So as you've been seeing last week, some politicians have been speaking out vociferously on this issue. Specifically, Representative Ed Markey in Massachusetts and Senator Joe Lieberman in Connecticut. They've called for a moratorium on new construction, at least until there is a thorough review of emergency response and safety procedures. Nonetheless, President Obama still appears very supportive of having more nuclear power in the United States. But the bottom line tends to be the bottom line. The capital cost and competition, specifically with natural gas, have raised pretty high financial barriers to new nuclear power. If you'd like to have more information about this topic or any other topics dealing with science and security, please visit FAS's website, fas.org. And I have a book coming out end of April, probably more like May, because I have to revise the book this week in light of last week's events, and I actually have some flyers for the book if you want to grab those to remind yourself to buy my book when it comes out in a month and a half. And then Professor Settle and I, we kicked off this book project in my previous job. So this book's been in the work for about 3 years or so, and it's just it's unfortunate that Japan's tragedy is unfortunately the book's opportunity. But in terms of if you say this is what everyone needs to know, you better cover this event in the book. And my editor last week said, Charles, you got to revise the book. So once I get back to the office tomorrow morning, I know what I need to do, as well as handling press events. So thank you so much for your attention. Hopefully I didn't go on too long, and hopefully we do have some time for some Q&A. Yes, sir.
Isn't it true that one of the major challenges is the roadblocks that the environmentalists put in the road? They were one of the, if I understand it correctly, they were a major force in holding up the Yucca Mountain thing. and in all areas. I mean, everyone's saying go to wind. I retired out in Massachusetts. The people who lived on the vineyard were held it up because the towers were going to spoil their view out in Nantucket Sound. So that's my second question, and you talked quite a bit about the nuclear waste. Is my understanding, I may be wrong, that under Carter's administration, the United States pushed an international treaty that prevented the commissioning, the reprocessing of nuclear energy?
Of the spent fuel to extract plutonium, that's right.
And that Great Britain is, I believe, one of the few nations that did sign it. And they're in the process, right, of building a plant of its Sellafield where they're decommissioning and doing remediation. So, we've perhaps tied our own hands, because I agree with you about the threat of all the nuclear waste.
Well, first let me take on the first point about the environmental movement. It's not monolithic. In fact, we've seen Patrick Moore, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace, which remains anti-nuclear. But Mr. Moore has seen the light, and he said he used to look on nuclear power as evil, and now he sees that it's something that we need. Although he admits that he's a skeptic when it comes to whether climate change is human-induced or not. We've seen James Lovelock in Britain, a British scientist, who invented the concept of Gaia, that Earth is this kind of Mother Earth that's it's a very complex system, and that we need to protect Gaia. And so he sees that nuclear power is a major part of the solution to preventing further damage to the Earth because of climate change. So that's two examples of environmentalists who are very supportive of nuclear power, but there are still environmentalists in Greenpeace and other organizations that are very against nuclear power. And as I indicated pretty briefly in terms of the streamlined regulatory process, the idea there was to give defined opportunities for whether it's environmentalists or anti-nuclear activists to intervene when it's appropriate, and under certain guidelines, and not just do it willy-nilly. So we're seeing whether that'll work or not in the last few years, as there have been a renewed interest in some nuclear power plants in the United States. So, just stay tuned to see if that works or not. That may need to be tweaked or may need to be overhauled. Second question about the use of reprocessing. You go back to 1950s and 1960s when nuclear power was just getting going. And there was talk about having several thousand nuclear reactors in the world. Right now we have roughly 440. And so if, the worries that there wasn't enough uranium in the world to fuel all those reactors. So back then the United States was supportive of reprocessing to extract plutonium, to recycle it, and also to develop breeder reactors that would breed plutonium, to use a type of technology called a fast neutron reactor. What happened was a number of things. One is that uranium tended to be more abundant than the geologists originally thought it was, and we saw that start to play out in the mid-1970s, that uranium supplies were found to be pretty abundant. Two, the cost of nuclear power tended to go up, and the projections of nuclear power were revised, and so instead of 10,000 reactors in the 21st century, now it's looking like maybe we might be lucky to get 1,000 reactors by the end of the century. So in terms of, there's been an order of magnitude change in the amount of nuclear power we thought we were going to have. So that reduces the demand for uranium. And then plutonium-based fuels tend to be more expensive. Reprocessing facilities can cost several billion or tens of billions of dollars, as I mentioned, and these are heavily government subsidized. So then who bears the burden are the utility ratepayers in those countries. They're paying an extra amount of money for their electricity. Now, admittedly, it's not that much more money. In France, it's estimated they pay 10% more for their nuclear generate electricity because of reprocessing than they would otherwise. So that's maybe a reasonable price to pay for that kind of program, if that program offered a solution for nuclear waste. But because the way reprocessing is practiced today commercially, it actually generates more low-level waste, and the reprocessing is only done once through. So there's only a once-through recycling. And then the plutonium spent fuel that comes out is not reprocessed again. That's being stored. So you still have to deal with that spent fuel. So we haven't figured that out yet. Until we get fast neutron reactors that are cost-effective and can be operated safely and reliably, then I don't think we're going to be able to fully close the fuel cycle and, excuse me, and begin to reduce that waste problem. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick series of questions, and you can answer any of them or all of them.
Or yes and no, or maybe.
First of all, I listened to NPR on Sunday, and there was the IEER's Arjun Majani who was speaking, as well
Yes.
as the Kyoto-based Green Action environmentalist group, Eileen Smith. And there was some discussion about how in Japan at the Fukushima plants they have generators, backup generators, but in the United States there are no backup generators. So,
No, we have backup generators.
Okay, so so I was very curious.
Right. One difference though was that in the Japanese plant, the batteries they had, the final backup, had an 8-hour charge. Mm-hmm. Typically the batteries in the U.S. is up to about 4 hours. Mm-hmm. So that's really the only big difference that I know of. But we have emergency diesel generators at the U.S. plants. Right?
Okay, great. Another thing in terms of what's happening in Japan now, you say it's a good thing if, in fact, the core has not been breached. That's what you don't want to see. And yet the reports are of cesium and strontium and iodine, radioactive iodine, and in the water as far as Tokyo as of today, where they're doing readings twice a day in each prefecture. Mm-hmm. So I wonder that can only come from the core. Sure,
that's right. And those are still fairly trace amounts that they're observing. They're not huge releases by any means. Nonetheless, I don't want to minimize this because the Tokyo Electric Power Corporation, they're clearly indicating that the reactor cores are partially uncovered in reactors 1, 2, and 3. So that's not a good situation to continue. They need to get that recovered, because every time they do that venting, because they don't have the filtration system I talked about, they end up releasing radioactive materials into the environment. So that's the origin of that radioactive iodine, strontium, cesium that's being detected.
Also, in the Japanese media, when they show the way the reactors, what the reactors look like on the inside, they show that the spent fuel pools and beyond, not number 4, but 1, 2, 3, are at the top.
Yes.
Rather at the bottom. And I'm sort of interested in why that would be.
Right. That's a very interesting question. And it was I understand, a design convenience when the boiling water reactors were being designed. Remember, I had that diagram where you have the reactor core down toward the bottom, and you have this big reactor pressure vessel because you have steam formation happening up at the top. And so when they shut down the reactor for refueling and they extract the spent fuel assemblies, they can lift those up by a crane and take them out from the top of the reactor pressure vessel and lift, and then just carry it over to spent fuel pool and set it in the water. So it's determined to be easier for them to do that than to do like they do with a pressurized water reactor. It's a different design in that the spent fuel pools tend to be buried, so they're below sea level grade, and so it's much, much harder to drain a pressurized water reactor spent fuel pool than is a BW reactor spent fuel pool.
But that's creating certain problems now.
Exactly, that's right. So all 4 of those reactors, well, actually there's 6 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi plant, and they're all boiling water reactors, so they all have that kind of spent fuel pool design where it's raised up above the surface.
My final question is a more political one, and that has to do with in the past decade, and actually before that revealed later, certain sort of collusive activities between PEPCO and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in Japan. that has been verified. And so I wonder, you know, when there are safety issues and when the utilities company is working hand in hand with the sort of in the NPR discussion on Thursday, we were comparing that to the SEC supposedly being a watchdog on the so on Wall Street, but that is not working when they work hand in glove. So I was wondering what you.
Yeah, and I don't know a lot of the details on that. I just whatever I've been reading and the reporting. But go back to 2002, there were I think 29 counts of suspected fraud of data, basically fudging, and TEPCO's CEO and other executives were forced to resign. But the problem still wasn't solved because a few years later there was another incident that believed that there was further fudging of data. In fact, at a couple of the Fukushima reactors, we're going back as late as 1985, that the core coolant temperatures that were written down were different than what they actually were. Now, that's cause for concern, and it may not say that there's a significant safety problem at that plant, but nonetheless it shows that management and maybe the whole industry was not fully on board with the safety culture, and that there might have been a too close a relationship between the regulatory agency and the utilities. Japan, they have 10 major utilities and providing about 85% of electricity. Those utilities have monopoly power on the regional level. And they, because of that, they have a lot of influence on local and national governments. And so this is not the first time concerns have been raised about that kind of a situation. And I want, at least in this country, we do have a fairly strong regulatory commission. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is the role model for regulatory commissions throughout the world. When I've traveled around the world, as Frank Settle mentioned, every time I meet with officials in other countries, especially regulatory officials, they say we look to the NRC as the gold standard. We're not saying it's perfect, but at least it is the best system that we've seen throughout the world in terms of how to have a strong regulatory agency that has the authority to order a plant shutdown if there's a safety violation. You're welcome. Yes, sir.
What was it actually that overwhelmed the plant? I'm not quite clear. Was it the earthquake itself caused something to fracture? Was it water rushing in, or both?
It's more the water. So it was that 1-2 punch. So when the earthquake hit the plant, the shaking, there were seismometers at the plant, and that sent a signal to the operating reactors to shut down. That worked properly. The reactors shut down. That's good news.
All of them did?
All of them did. So there are the 6 reactors at Fukushima. 1, 2, and 3 were operating at the time. 4, 5, and 6 were not operating. 1, 2, and 3, the control rods were inserted. Reactor shut down. About an hour later, this big wall of water came in, a tsunami, and that was triggered by the earthquake. It's this subduction zone earthquake just offshore, and this wall, it's traveling in about 500 miles an hour, and the tsunami height was above the design of the seawall. So everything exceeded design basis. The earthquake was about magnitude 9 on Richter scale, off the charts in terms of the 140 years they've been keeping records in Japan. They weren't expecting that, and they weren't expecting such a huge tsunami. And then you could raise the question, should they have placed the emergency diesel generators where they did, susceptible to the flooding? So I think that can point to a design flaw of the plant. Right, and I think if we didn't have the emergency diesel generators being knocked out, we wouldn't be talking right now about this issue. I think they've gotten things under control. They haven't really. It just every now and then it comes up in some interviews I've done, but no one's really followed that line of argument.
It wouldn't be that hard to fix that.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. Just lift those up so they're safe from. Exactly. That's right. In the back, yes.
In the normal course of events, though, you'd still be connected to the grid.
Yes.
And so it was really 2 backup systems.
Right. And so you got kind of 3 electrical backup systems. You had off-site power. That got knocked out because of the huge earthquake and tsunami. You had the emergency diesel generators got flooded, it got knocked out. And then the backup battery power, you had up to 8 hours charge, but that wasn't enough time to restore off-site power or to get other generators in place.
Okay, one more question.
If you were advising the Japanese government right now, number one, what would you have them do with the immediate situation? And number two, what would you have them do in the rebuilding phase?
Great, and I actually have some op-eds about that just this past week in Kyoto News, which is a major Japanese newspaper service, and a Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And so I said immediate term, in terms of just look at electricity, getting that restored again. I think they're doing what they can in terms of dealing with that power plant, and that I can't offer an advice about that. They know what to do far better than I do. But I think in terms of getting electricity back again and getting their society back in order, they're going to rely more on natural gas. It sounds, I sound like a broken record. I don't own stock in natural gas. I'm not like your natural gas salesman here. But the fact remains that Japan has been a leader in importing liquid natural gas. They import about 30% of the world's stock of LNG, and that's going to go up. They have about more than 40 terminals to receive LNG, and only one major terminal at Sendai was significantly damaged by the earthquake and tsunami. So they have plenty of capacity to receive LNG, and they're going to do it. So that's the immediate term for electricity. Longer term, I would advise them not to phase out nuclear power, but not to rely on nuclear power as much as they had planned to do. Right now, before the earthquake, they were generating about 30% electricity from nuclear. They had plans to go up to about 50% in the next 20 or 30 years or so, and maybe go much beyond that. My opinion is that's too much reliance on nuclear power for Japan. They need to rebalance their portfolio and immediately put in place better policies to ramp up renewables like solar, wind, and geothermal, and have that in the mix, much higher in the mix with nuclear.
Well, thank you, Charles. It's really good to have your insights. I have two kind of quick comments, very short comments. On the basis of what Charles has said, the energy picture, I think natural gas is probably the oxycodone of energy. And the other thing that you really realize in this, it takes electricity to generate electricity. And I think people sometimes don't realize that. You've got to have a certain amount of electricity to run the pumps and keep everything going. So with those words, we'll give Charles one final hand.